Illegal then, legal now. Migration histories and the myth of legitimacy. Illegal. It sounds absolute, final, clear, undeniable. A word that appears to describe a fixed condition, a line crossed, a rule broken, a status assigned. It carries moral weight as well as legal meaning. It suggests not only that something is against the law, but that it is inherently wrong. But that assumption deserves scrutiny because there was a time when migration was not regulated in the way it is today, when people crossed borders without documents, not because they were breaking the law, but because the legal framework did not yet exist. So, what does it mean to call someone illegal? Are we describing a person, or are we describing a rule, one that has been written, rewritten, and enforced differently across time? The word illegal feels stable. History suggests otherwise. What appears fixed is, in fact, constructed. It is no longer who is legal, it becomes who decides. Can a person be illegal, or only the system that defines them? Legitimacy is not a natural condition. It is a legal and political construct, defined by laws that are created, interpreted, and enforced by states. This means that legitimacy is not constant, it shifts. What is permitted in one context may be restricted in another. What is legal in one country may be illegal in another. What is accepted in one period may be prohibited in the next. According to the frameworks developed by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, categories such as refugee, asylum seeker, and irregular migrant are defined through international agreements and national legislation. These categories are necessary for administrative purposes, but they are not fixed in a historical sense. They evolve. This has important implications. If legality is defined by law and law changes, then legality changes with it. This means that the label illegal is not inherent to a person, it is assigned. And because it is assigned, it reflects the priorities, values, and power structures of the system that assigns it. This system does not mean that laws are arbitrary, but it does mean that they are contingent. They respond to political, economic, and social conditions, and those conditions are never static. If legality depends on changing laws, can it ever be absolute? In the 19th century, large-scale migration occurred with relatively few formal restrictions. People moved across borders for work, for survival, for opportunity. Documentation requirements were minimal or non-existent in many regions. Borders were not yet governed by the complex systems of control that exist today. This does not mean that movement was entirely free. It was shaped by economic conditions, by social structures, by informal barriers, but it was not regulated in the same legal sense. According to the International Organization for Migration, modern systems of border control developed gradually, particularly in the early 20th century. The introduction of passports, visas, and immigration quotas transformed movement into something that required formal authorization. This transformation did not occur because migration itself changed. It occurred because the systems governing it changed. A person who moved freely in one period might be classified as illegal in another, not because their actions were different, but because the rules were. Consider migration in the United States in the late 19th century. Millions arrived without passports or formal documentation. They were processed through administrative systems, but they were not labeled as illegal in the way that term is used today. The concept of illegal migration emerged later as laws became more restrictive. This reveals something important. Illegality is not a timeless condition. It is a product of specific legal frameworks. If past migration would be considered illegal today, what does that say about the present definition? The instability of legality becomes clearer when we examine specific cases. In early 20th century Europe and North America, immigration laws became increasingly restrictive. Quotas were introduced, categories were defined, entry was regulated more tightly. Groups that had previously migrated with relative ease found themselves excluded. The change was not in the people, it was in the policy. Similarly, internal migration has often been regulated differently across contexts. Systems such as internal passports or permits have been used to control movement within countries. In some cases, individuals moving without authorization were classified as illegal, even within their own national territory. This illustrates how legality is tied to administrative frameworks rather than inherent characteristics. More recently, asylum systems have introduced additional layers of complexities. Individuals fleeing conflict may be recognized as refugees under international law, but their status depends on legal processes that vary across jurisdictions. A person may be considered legal in one country and illegal in another. The distinction is not based solely on their circumstances. It is based on how those circumstances are interpreted within a given legal system. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, this variability reflects the interaction between international norms and national sovereignty. States retain the authority to define and enforce their own immigration laws. These creates inconsistency. And within that inconsistency, the concept of illegality becomes unstable. If the same person can be legal in one place and illegal in another, what defines their status? How illegal becomes identity. Language plays Language plays a central role in stabilizing the concept of illegality. The term illegal is often used not only to describe actions, but to define people. Oops, let me pause this a second. This shift from action to identity is significant. It transforms a legal classification into a personal attribute. A person becomes illegal rather than having committed an act that is defined as such. This distinction matters because it shapes perception. When illegality is attached to identity, it becomes more difficult to separate legal status from moral judgment. The term carries implications beyond law. It suggests wrongdoing even when the circumstances are complex. Media coverage can reinforce this association. When migration is described in terms of illegality, it becomes framed as a problem to be controlled rather than a phenomenon to be understood. This does not mean that laws should not be enforced. But it does mean that language influences how those laws are interpreted. According to the International Argument for Migration, media framing plays a significant role in shaping public attitudes towards migration. Reported use of terms such as illegal can contribute to a perception that migrants are inherently problematic, rather than individuals navigating legal systems that are themselves complex, variable, and potentially problematic. When we use the word illegal, what assumptions are we making about the person it describes? It is important to recognize that legal frameworks serve necessary functions. They regulate movement. They define rights and responsibilities. They provide structure and systems that would otherwise be difficult to manage. Without legal definitions, it would be challenging to administer immigration systems, to process asylum claims, or to enforce border policies. This is a valid argument. Law provides order, but order is not the same as neutrality, because the creation of law involves decisions about inclusion and exclusion. Who is allowed to enter, under what conditions, for how long. These decisions are shaped by political priorities, economic considerations, and social pressures. They are not purely technical, they are normative. This means that while legality is necessary, it is not objective in a timeless sense. It reflects choices, and these choices can change. The existence of law does not make its outcomes inevitable, it makes them structured. If laws define legitimacy, who defines the laws? Legitimacy is often presented as fixed, but history shows that legitimacy is not fixed. It moves, it shifts with policy, with context, with interpretation. What is considered legitimate today may not be considered so tomorrow, and what was considered legitimate in the past may now be prohibited. And this does not mean that all definitions are arbitrary, but it does mean that they are contingent. They depend on systems that evolve. Understanding this does not eliminate the need for law, but it changes how we interpret it. It allows us to see legality not as an inherent quality, but as a classification, one that is amplified within specific frameworks. And once we recognize that, the question changes. It is no longer simply who is illegal or illegal. It becomes how are these categories defined and why? A line is drawn, a rule is written, a category is created, and suddenly a person becomes something else. Not because they changed, but because the definition did. Movement continues, but meaning shifts. And in that shift, legitimacy reveals itself, not as a constant, but as a decision. The concept of illegal migration is historically constructed and legally defined. It reflects changing laws and political decisions rather than fixed truths about people. Take a moment to reflect. Is illegality a condition or a label applied by systems that change over time?